guide people on what we can do to make our city more resilient, but specifically individual properties more resilient and insulate our own properties from the impacts of climate change. Sort of like the genesis of this process began around Superstorm Sandy in about 2015. There were guidelines that were issued, and we're in the process now of creating an addendum to those guidelines based upon what we're seeing, and I believe what many of you have observed as shifting and more severe impacts of climate change in your own homes. So, while we're taking larger scale measures to protect the city, such as Rebuild by Design, some of the resiliency parks throughout the city, that has not provided a holistic solution to some of what we saw this summer. For example, ground level units, basement or garden level units that hadn't previously been impacted by flooding were now impacted. I can count myself as amongst one of the people impacted by this recent shift that I observed this summer. Just anecdotally, during Superstorm Sandy, the ground level of my home never flooded, and it had never flooded previously during Irene either. And then all of a sudden, last summer, there were 2 or 3 clips of a very severe rain events. During one of them, I believe, Hurricane Ida, for the first time ever, we saw flooding. And I also received a number of other communications from other residents who said that we had never received flooding impacts before, but now we're receiving them. They're causing property damage to our homes, and that triggered a larger discussion of what we can do on a case-by-case, on an individual basis to make our homes more resilient, protect the value of our properties, and really invest in our properties in a way to mitigate and sort of push back a little bit on this trend. So that's the reason why I believe had a meeting previously this year to take in resident feedback on what they're experiencing. And we've gathered together here today a number of professionals in their different spheres to offer you, all licensed professionals, to offer some guidance on, how you can protect your own homes and make them more resilient. And that will ultimately take the form of an addendum to the Resilient Building Design Guidelines. The addendum itself, we'd like it to be a living document. It's always subject to adjustment and growth and change as we go through the years. But I think it can be a very useful and effective reference point for residents who are experiencing things that we just haven't experienced in the past, and provide some educational guidance on what we can do on a case-by-case basis to protect our homes from some of the flooding impacts or rain impacts we've seen, especially last summer. So I just want to thank Yasmin for leading this meeting and for her efforts in bringing together some of the design and other professionals, and for hosting this meeting. Also want to thank our Assistant Business Administrator, Caleb Stratton. He's a wealth of knowledge on all things resiliency related, and also Director Jennifer Gonzalez for all the work you do on this topic as well. So with that, I'll just kick it back to Yasmin, who'll lead the rest of the meeting. Thank you. Thanks a lot again for being here tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Mayor. With that, I'd like to introduce the rest of the project team and also mention that the NHSA is also in attendance this evening, who can also answer any questions, which we'll hold toward the end, but who are also available to answer questions that you all may have from the slides presented tonight. So with that, I'd like to first introduce the Michael Baker team. So Jessica, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jessica Jerry. I'm with Michael Baker. I'm a planner who's been working on resiliency for about 10 years now. I actually worked on the original design guidelines, and I'm thrilled to be back with the city looking at this update and addressing it for rainfall.
Great. And from LRK, I'd like to also introduce Chris Cassenda. Chris?
Yes, thank you. My name is Chris Cassenda, a planner at Looney Ricks Kiss in Philadelphia. I'm a municipal planner for Holland Park and Metuchen in Middlesex County, and have a lot of experience working on design guidelines throughout the region, and providing a lot of support to Michael Baker International. It's been a great pleasure working with Jessica and the city.
Great. And with that, we can jump into the presentation and go over some quick housekeeping items for this evening. Okay, so on the next slide, we're just going to go over some housekeeping items. This meeting is recorded. Therefore, for consistency and just for respect to the presenters this evening, if you could please, if you're joining this presentation, please turn your camera off, and please also stay on mute until the very end of the meeting. Please also hold all of your questions toward the end of the meeting. If you have a question that needs to be addressed or that you'd like to just, have addressed during the meeting, please post it in the chat, and we will try our best to get to that toward the end. Please also refrain from chatting together, in between conversations within the group chat, as this meeting is recorded, and we will be keeping record of the chat. And with that, I'd like to please welcome the Michael Baker team and also LRK team to continue into their presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. As the mayor mentioned, this project has been building on the workshop that was held in October post the flooding from last summer and September. And what we listened to the recordings of that workshop at the beginning of this project, and what we heard really helped inform our understanding of the different types of flooding that the residents are experiencing. We were able to do some site visits and meet with some residents who opened up their homes to us, which are incredibly grateful for that learning opportunity. And we've been working with NHSA on the work that they've been doing to help address homeowner concerns as well. So tonight we're going to present on the work to date, what's going to be coming in the draft addendum of the building design guidelines, so that you can have a better understanding of what this document's going to include and help provide any feedback on additional resources or information that you might find helpful as we move forward with the draft. We are going to be releasing the draft addendum this month, and then we'll follow up with a final document, a final addendum in July. There will be a public feedback survey that'll open up after the presentation tonight, and we'll close on the 20th. So there'll be opportunity, in addition to the question and answer period of this presentation, to provide feedback through that survey. Go ahead to the next slide, Carrie. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit about the work that we've done with the site visits to date.
Thank you, Jessica. So as part of our initial research for this project, we reviewed GIS maps, we drove and walked around the city, and we've spoken with and met with some residents at their properties. So generally speaking, we tend to find that there's two main categories of buildings. One is you have the large scale, mixed use, multifamily buildings and redevelopment projects. So these buildings are generally code compliant and generally contain parking, storage, or non-residential uses on the ground floor, especially if they were constructed recently in a flood-prone area. And two are the historic brownstones, which have residential uses on the ground floor and often with spaces partially or even fully underground. These building types are typically 3 to 4 stories in height and are located on 20-foot to 25-foot wide lots. So it's really these units that we're focusing on with respect to the residential building design guidelines. Then it's intended to focus on these types, smaller scale properties. And on the next slide, we'll start looking at 3 main building types that we prepared for the addendum. So first, we're going to start with the cellar building type. Now, before we get into the weeds too far, I just want to clarify that often you hear basement and cellar, they're used interchangeably, but they're actually very much different. The easiest way to differentiate between the two is where the bottom story is relative to street level or the sidewalk. A basement is where the story is partially below the sidewalk, but at least 1/2 of it is above the sidewalk. A cellar is the opposite condition, in which case where more than 1/2 of its height is below the sidewalk, and in many cases actually entirely underground. So that being said, this building type, the cellar condition, can be characterized with about 3 or 4 steps leading up to the first floor and several steps leading out to the cellar. Sometimes the front entry to that cellar is open to the air, like you see in the diagram, but they're often covered with a bill-coat door. The cellar is generally used for storage. You have HVAC equipment, some laundry facilities, and may in some cases may contain a small bathroom. And as such, they're usually unfinished spaces, and they have a really short ceiling height, 6, 7, maybe 8 feet, or it can simply just be a crawl space. The cellar can be at the bottom floor of a single multi-level townhouse unit above it, or it can be the shared common area for a multiple multi-unit apartment or condominium building. Next, we have what's regionally referred to as the garden apartment. So this building type can be characterized as the 8 to 10 steps leading up to the first floor and just a few steps leading up to a small private courtyard prior to entering the front door of the garden apartment. And as you can see in the diagram, there's often a secondary door which leads to a common area hallway, or it can be a common mechanical room that serves the entire building. Generally speaking, the garden apartment, as we would expect, is a fully furnished, fully functional apartment, 1 or 2 bedrooms containing living, dining spaces, as well as a kitchen and 1 or 2 bathrooms. And as such, again, they're fully finished spaces with a full ceiling height, 8, 9, maybe 10 feet tall. The garden apartment can be a rental unit underneath a multi-unit townhouse unit, or they can be part of a multi-unit apartment or condominium building, which is usually the case. And finally, on the third slide, we have what we are referring to as the flush or at-grade building type. As it's implied, it's pretty much at grade with the sidewalk. There's maybe 1 step leading up to the first floor, and it may have a crawl space or a cellar. Usually the living space is, again, accessible through 1 step. And in terms of the front entry door, we found in one particular neighborhood where there were actually enclosed spaces prior to entering the unit, which were probably in the right-of-way, which is not uncommon in many older cities. So the building is generally a single multi-unit townhouse, but it could be a multi-unit apartment or condominium building. So we prepared these diagrams to really help kind of really paint the picture of, illustrate to the reader how the plumbing system generally interacts with the combined sewer system that Hoboken has. As you're aware, the city has, like in many other older cities, a combined sewer system where both stormwater runoff enters the sewer system and flows through the same pipes as wastewater or sewage does. So in light blue, we have those that really manage stormwater, rainwater, as well as groundwater. They're typically yard drains, you have gutters and downspouts, or in this case, in the diagram, a centralized roof drain. You also have exterior floor drains in front of the building. as well as interior floor drains and sump pit. Then, of course, you have located letter D, the storm sewer inlet along the curb within a public right of way. In dark blue, you have those devices that handle or collect wastewater. Those are individual appliances such as a kitchen sink, dishwasher, bathroom sink, toilet, showers, and so on and so forth. And they generally have a vent stack or multiple vent stack depending on the location of the rooms. And finally, they all combine into purple, the sewer lateral. So this is where all those pipes connect from the home into the storm sewer main underneath the street. It should be noted, though, that in this diagram, we're showing in I the sewer lateral to be underground. It could very well be, like in my old townhouse, it's actually in the basement, hung from the ceiling joist. So to go to the next slide. So understanding how the plumbing system work helped us understand really the common entry points for how stormwater overflows and sewer backups into your property. And this has really helped us frame how to organize the various mitigation measures that Jessica will go into shortly. So just to kind of give you a high level of what where water is coming from. So for example, you have saturated soils and sheet water runoff from your own yard or even neighboring yards, which will bring water into your basement. The high concentration of water on the roof into a single point, which shoots water down and overburdens the overall system. You have backed up storm sewers inlets, which overflow water onto the sidewalk, which may sheet flow down the steps into your unit. And there's even cases where water backed up in the street, the wave action from motor vehicles passing through unpaved streets pushes water onto the sidewalk and down again into your unit. With respect to groundwater, again, you have saturated soils or high water table, which contribute to water seeping into the floors, as well as the walls, especially if they're cracked or unsealed. And of course, malfunctioning sump pumps may lead to the unit not keeping up with removing the groundwater from your unit. With regard to wastewater, simply put, if you have clogged or leaky pipes, even those from upper floors, they may impact the lower levels, in particular at a localized level. But if left unchecked system-wide, all those impact the overall system and may impact several low-lying properties. And then, of course, these conditions can extend to the main sewer system, sewer lateral, and these are often difficult to diagnose. You may have a sewer lateral that's clogged with tree roots or other debris. They may be leaking without you knowing, and in some cases, the sewer laterals or the house traps may just be collapsed. And that could lead to water backing up into your unit at a local level. And of course, you have the condition where when the overall system is overburdened during a wet storm season or a storm event, then it could actually reverse flow from the sewer main into your unit and so on. Jessica, take it from here.
Thanks, Chris. So all of that was to help us kind of understand how Hoboken floods and help prepare what homeowners can do. So what is included in this addendum is 4 different sections. The first one is just context for those residents that may be unaware of Hoboken's unique topography, high groundwater table, and combined sewer system. It's just sort of to help educate and recognize that, as the mayor mentioned, we are expecting that to see increased intensity in storms due to climate change. So when the original guidelines were created, the focus was really in the wake of Sandy, flooding coming from the river and a coastal storm event. That has evolved over time. And so this addendum is going to reflect the increased flood risk that Hoboken is seeing and is going to continue to see. The second section is focusing a lot on what Chris just talked about. How do you understand the system and your own building? How do you make the determination of all of the different strategies that you might be able to take? What makes the most sense for your property? And that's going to vary depending on whether or not you live in the floodplain, whether or not you live in a condo versus a single family home, and the actual systems that you're that are within your system, that are within your property. But we're going to spend the bulk of the remainder of the presentation focused on what strategies we're including in the addendum. So we have broken out the strategies into these 4 categories that you see here, and we're going to go into those in a little bit more detail. And then the last section that's included in the addendum is permitting and approvals. And we're not going to touch on that too much tonight, but it will be included in the addendum so that once you decide which of the strategies work best for your property, it'll help inform sort of the next steps and how you move forward to work with the city and get those strategies implemented. Go ahead to the next slide, Carrie. So the 4 buckets of strategies that are included in this addendum are maintain indoor and outdoor infrastructure. And that's really focused on sort of your first steps of making sure that your pipes are not leaking, that there are not tree roots growing through them, as Chris mentioned. Some of the maintenance that needs to happen is a precursor to making sure that you don't need a more in-depth intervention. So taking these kind of low-hanging fruit first steps to make sure that your pipes are all in really good condition will help save a bigger, more exacerbated problem going forward. A second strategy that we're looking at is preventing the flooding to the extent that we can actually keep the flood waters out of your home. Now, with a residential unit, there are some limitations to what is appropriate to permanently prevent flooding from your building, but we will go into the different strategies that you can use. And those that attended the workshop in October heard a lot of conversation around some of these strategies, ejector pump, check valves in particular. So the third category is if water does enter your home, the steps you can take to reduce the damage that it causes. And then the last category is how to reduce the stormwater impacts, both on the combined sewer system, which will help alleviate the burden and potentially minimize backups in wet weather, as well as potentially reducing your own stormwater overflow issues if you have a property in which you're actually getting flooding from the rain event off of your property, from the stormwater flow off of your property, whether it's down the stairs or otherwise. So those are the 4 categories. We're going to go through them in a little bit more detail. There will be, and kind of give you an idea of the types of information that are going to be included in the addendum itself. And then we can open it up to questions. Go ahead, Carrie. So this is an example of what is going to be included in the addendum. This is what we're referring to as a strategy fact sheet. And it goes through a little bit of information about each of the strategies that was just on the previous slide, how it might help, who should be considering this strategy, what limitations there might be, whether or not you're going to need a permit or whether you should be looking at a contractor, and any other sort of considerations for installation and maintenance that you should be thinking about. Additionally, where there are additional resources that we can direct you, there are a lot of guidance from nonprofits, other government agencies, federal agencies that we can provide for you so you can start to do a little bit more research about the strategy if it's something that you're going to consider. Go ahead, Carrie. Thanks. So when we're talking about the strategies, I'm not going to read through these. What I want to point out here is I mentioned these are sort of your initial efforts of making sure that your piping is in good condition. And if you do move forward with an ejector pump, if you are looking to work with NHSA on their program, many of these are actually a requirement in order to qualify for the grant, just to make sure that it is actually necessary to that your piping is in good condition before you move forward with that intervention. The second set of strategies, as I mentioned, is going to kind of depend on your particular situation. But this is the ways that a homeowner can prevent flooding from entering a residential unit. And this is something that you'll be working with both the city and potentially NHSA if you're looking at the ejector pump to prevent backflow. the water resistant materials, elevate equipment are some of the basic efforts that you can do that if water were to enter your home, it'll reduce the amount of damage that you experience. As Chris mentioned, many of the cellar conditions are often used for storage. And there are ways to just make sure that when you are storing stuff down there that you're protecting it from potentially getting wet as well. If you are able to, sorry, Kay, if you're able to take an even further step, the last three are actually measures that you can take to allow water to enter your property. Flood vents are where you allow water to enter your property, but limit the amount of damage that occurs, and then you can actually fill in your cellar or raise your floor above the design flood elevation in order to reduce the amount of damage that the water causes. Go ahead. And then lastly, as we mentioned, these are strategies that reduce the burden on the sewer system. So it's really focused on stormwater management on your property, both in retaining it and decreasing the stormwater runoff, as well as just keeping any stormwater that comes from your property out of the combined sewer system. And with that, we're just going to cover briefly the types of approvals that are going to be included in the addendum. So we talk about construction and floodplain, and then whether you're in a historic preservation district, if you need a tree permit, the different types of sidewalk and street openings from both the city and the county. And we go into much more detail in the addendum on those. And with that, we're gonna wrap up the presentation part and open it up to questions. I'll call your attention to, on this slide, the QR code and the URL is the location of the feedback survey that'll be available until June 20th. And I'll turn it back over to Yasmin.
Thank you, Jessica. So as mentioned, we are now opening up the floor to you all. So feel free to turn on your cameras, and we're going to maybe stop sharing as well and start a Q&A session. I'll also drop the link to that survey in the chat so that you all have it available. And if you could use either the raise hand function or put in the chat that you have a question, we can go one by one and answer those. So I see that Kay Cohen has a question. Kay?
Sorry about that. I was typing it in, so I'll just ask it. So as you know, I circulated the survey that had over 200 responses, taking a quick overview of how townhomes flooded. Over 40% of people reported it came up their floor drains in the basement. Do you have any tactical advice on what those people can do?
So I can answer that. I think I can answer that. So there's two sections. The first is the investigative work that will help give North Hudson or the property owner better insight into how their existing sewer lateral is functioning. And the second is installing backflow prevention, and then also potentially an ejector system if necessary. So just to quickly describe those two things, backflow prevention does not allow sewer to backflow into a property. And Don, you're going to have to help me with this. If the hydraulic grade is higher at the street than the sewer lateral entering the property, and to describe hydraulic grade, basically, if the sewer system's overwhelmed, the first thing that would occur is water would backflow out of inlets at intersections. We see intersections flood. And then the second thing that would occur is that if that grade is higher than say the floor of a property, it would backflow into property, and backflow prevention is essentially a valve that closes, that doesn't allow the sewer system to backflow into a house. The second piece of that being the ejector system is that let's say you have a roof leader that's tied into your sewer system, and that if there is not enough pressure coming from your roof leader, so there's more pressure in the sewer system than on your roof leader may actually backflow into the house, and the ejector system would pressurize that system that's tying into the lateral to create positive pressure, so rainwater would still be able to flow into the sewer system, even if that sewer system is at full capacity. So those are two of the strategies that are recommended and further explored. And that I would also say that the addendum is going to be have a number of recommendations that is kind of a starting point for a homeowner to explore. But that should always be done with the assistance of a design professional, a licensed engineer, a registered architect, and the city and North Hudson, either through our construction code office or Phil's on the call. We can provide more information. Phil, if you want to talk about some of the resources that North Hudson has available.
Yeah, so I put my email out there to just about everybody that I've met with, and that was between 25 and 30 homeowners after the storm Ida, and I've offered to review anybody's videotape if they do get their sewer lateral cleaned and TV inspected. I will look at that, and I will give you my opinion on what kind of rehabilitation might be necessary. Also, I've talked through some of the preventative measures, and Caleb, you were right. It is a check valve and potentially a pump. The one thing that I don't think you covered is when you're pumping around the check valve, so you're pumping to the downstream side of the check valve. So in essence, you're forcing everything out of your property. And there are people that have check valves and still had flooding during Ida, and Ida was a very severe storm. And it was from the roof leaders, and it came up from any kind of. It usually comes up the lowest point, which is the floor drain. But if you have bathrooms or showers or backyard drains, these are all potential sources for stormwater to enter your basement.
May I speak? This is Kay again.
Sure.
So thanks for going over those options. I think most of the people in the group are pretty familiar with them. The issue is, so I did the check valve, and Caleb helped me with the permitting. Phil, you were there every step of the way and me figuring out what to do. So hopefully I haven't handled my problem, but it cost $11,000 so far, and I still haven't put back together my house. The pump system, the ejector pump you're talking about, that's being quoted at, what it is 45 to 65,000. It's very expensive. Not everyone can afford to do those things. So, I was wondering, for interim measures, for people out there who might not have the budget, like, what do you think about, do you have some tactical advice, like maybe removing the toilets from the basement? That only costs a few $100s, while they save up to find a more permanent solution, or having those little screw in, flood guards, the things with the little balls in them that rise when you have overflow. Can you give some cheaper, like more budget friendly options to people who don't have the budget?
Okay, those are certainly options. You can essentially abandon all your drains and facilities in the basement. The one thing that I would caution you is that water is then going to back up your main stack, to some degree, and you have to make sure that your stack is in, properly sealed so that it doesn't become a source of like a way for the water to get around. Water tries to find a way. But yeah, you can certainly abandon some of your plumbing in the cellar, or you can reroute roof leaders to the outside of the building and then just simply put a check valve in like you have. And that can solve the problem as well.
I saw a question pop up about the slides from this presentation. We intend to post the slides.
Yes, they'll be posted to the city's website. In addition to the recording of this presentation and a link to the survey. And again, the survey will be open until June 20th. There was another question in the chat that I saw to please address the water gate that is raised and lowered at 14th Street.
Phil, you're outside plant operations. I'll let you handle that one.
14th Street, there's no gate. We do have outfalls, CSO outfalls. We have one at the end of 15th Street, one at the end of 11th Street, one at 5th Street, and essentially one down by the pass station. But those work automatically. There is no button that we can press to close a gate and prevent water from either entering or flooding the streets under certain circumstances.
So part of what I would call it as legacy infrastructure is that tide gates used to be open and closed, but what North Hudson has on their system is called a duckbill valve. And so that valve is open. And then if you could picture a duck's bill, that bill is closed just based on the pressure from tides immediately adjacent to the outfall. So if the water cannot flow out of those pipes because of the tide height, they're closed. And so there's not backflow into North Hudson system. So I think that the question was maybe related to a piece of infrastructure that we no longer have in the system. Is that accurate, Phil?
So to get back to it, a duckbill or the tide gates we have are giant check valves like you put on your house to protect your house. It just stops water from backing up from the river. There is on 14th Street a storm sewer outfall, and I think that's being utilized in parts of the sewer separation project for rebuild by design. They've added some additional storm drains to that, which actually takes some of the pressure off the combined sewer. So should essentially, it should help a little.
In that system that you're referencing, the sewer separation, that was just completed in the last few months and tied in, and it was not online last summer. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And it primarily was focused on areas that are going to be on the outbound side of the flood barrier. And it's to help protect the city if there is another Sandy type event where the river overflows the banks and then finds a passage through the old combined sewer underneath the wall. So this was meant to prevent that from happening.
I see Ron Rosenberg has his hand raised. Ron, if you'd like to speak.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, panel. I do not live in a small house anymore. I actually do live in a condominium, and we have actually experienced consistent flooding. We have flooded during Sandy, during Irene, during Ida. Every time we flood, there is roughly, between building and personal property, there is roughly $1 million worth of damage. That is a significant number. And I want to give a shout out, Mayor, to Caleb, who is the first city official who came to our property and worked with us and to develop a game plan on how we can mitigate exposure in the future. And we are going to start submitting some permits through the system. My question today is relating to the possibility of installing a water holding tank between or someplace in the on the property that Newman Leather is going to give back to the city, so that the neighborhood can enjoy additional relief from possible flooding.
Yeah, Ron, we talked about this previously, and so I think all options are on the table, especially if we're returning right of way back into the city street network. What you're describing is just an additional retention tank for your property, but not within the parcel limits, but immediately adjacent. So I'm
for the adjacent properties.
and I'm happy to continue that conversation. There are examples of that in our system right now that North Hudson is permitted as part of a either a redevelopment or new construction. And you know, I can connect you with Phil to talk through what those requirements are. Phil, I think that they're actually posted online. But yeah, the city would be happy to explore that option.
So Caleb, feel free to share my email address. I have a brochure. I'd be more than happy to make a site visit and, you know, offer any kind of recommendations that seem appropriate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks. So Phil, we'll drop your email in the chat and also send it following this meeting. There's another question here. The permitting process for a residence ejector pump took up to 3 months. She is wondering what you can do to facilitate permits, construction, and parking.
Well, on the city side, everyone has my email here. I can help, and I have helped some of the folks try to navigate that process. And I'm just happy to be looped in to make sure that we are reviewing things in a timely manner. Some of the initial delay may have come from the fact that this is not a code requirement per se. And we had to internally, the city had to internally kind of build a process by which our construction code office was reviewing changes to the plumbing fixtures that weren't tied to uniform construction code requirements. And I think that we kind of have that ironed out. And as always, we've talked with North Hudson, we can collaborate. I think that Phil and I can be resources on making sure that those things are reviewed expeditiously. And I saw the mayor had a question pop up about grant funding. Phil, do you want to talk a little bit about financial assistance that North Hudson's offering for the ejector pump, and then also technical assistance if people have questions about backflow prevention?
Yeah, so the authority is essentially offering a $5,000 financial assistance to anybody that's interested in pursuing a project that's going to protect their property against surcharges of the sewer system. We've looked at applications for people that have wave action from street flooding, and even a combination of the two. So some of the resources are, well, I'm primarily the resource because I offer to come out and visit with folks and give them my thoughts and review their video inspections. And I think it was said before that some of the requirements to qualify for the grant is one, you have to provide a current video inspection of your sewer. The grant is meant to protect your property, not to repair a damaged or other system problems that may exist in your lateral. The second thing is we want a plan signed by a professional engineer so that we can assure that if there's pumpage, that the pump is sized right, and that the check valve is put in the right part of the system, and we cover all those spaces. So really, it's getting the video inspection done. Once you have that, I will send you an application. The application is pretty straightforward, but it does require a plan from a professional engineer. We will review those plans in-house, make sure that we feel that they're appropriate, and then give you the go-ahead. You can do the work. Once the work is completed, the authority will reimburse you up to $5,000.
Thank you, Phil. Barry, do you have your hand raised?
Hi, I'm Phil. I'm sorry I jumped in roughly a half hour late. When you talk about $5,000 and you also talked about a surcharge, not against a surcharge, what's the reference to that?
No, I'm not talking about surcharge in a financial way. It's a surcharge of the sewer system. When the sewer system backs up, we call it a surcharge.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there was another question in the chat that came up, that the flood mitigation that was done to collect rainwater and push it into the Hudson River is seen as problematic. The pressure from the pumps, like the one on 11th Street between Washington Street and Hudson Street, is causing the issue for people on Hudson Street. When it runs to pump out the water when there is a high tide, the back pressure forces the water into the other parts of the sewer system, where it finds its way into the lower drains into people's homes. So what can be done to mitigate this?
I can take this one if you don't mind, Phil.
Sure.
This is something that we've talked about a few different times. So I'm going to say the same thing again. The wet weather pump station that was installed for the H5 system, the one at 11th Street, does not cause backups. Flat out, it prevents backups. That's the entire purpose of it. So on the 11th Street traffic island, there's actually two different pump stations there. There's one that's working all the time. It's pumping right now. It's our sanitary pump station that pumps pretty much all of the flow from Hoboken to the wastewater treatment plant up at 1600 Adams Street, where I sit and Phil sits every day. That pump station is always online and always pumping flow to us. During wet weather, obviously, it's pumping even more flow to us because we're taking all that as well. The H5 wet weather pump station, which sits just slightly east of that, the pump station that you can see above ground, is entirely underground. And you'll recall we discussed regulators earlier. Regulators are what allow flow to go directly to the Hudson River that we can't handle at the plant. So the regulator is essentially a static weir wall, right? So the level in the sewer system, we keep talking about hydraulic grade line. That hydraulic grade line raises up, it goes literally over a weir, dumps over, and goes out by gravity to that outfall to the river. The wet weather pump station, the idea behind that is after the water has already gone over that weir, if it's a high tide, it's pumping against a higher hydraulic grade line. So by gravity, it won't be able to flow to the Hudson River. So that pump station is there to force the water out. There is no back pressure. That's not a thing with pumps at all. There's front pressure. It's a lot of pressure out the front. It's 40 million gallons that it's shooting out into the Hudson River during wet weather events. So the idea behind those pump stations, again, after it's already overflowed, the regulator is to help the water move out to allow more water to come in from behind it and further send it. Those houses on Hudson Street are not even connected to that outfall system. Those houses flow actually the other direction, right, Phil? They flow south. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. So Hudson Street flows directly to the siphon head box that goes to the plant. It's not hydraulically really connected at all to the line that benefits from the H1 are the H5 pump station. So they're pretty much hydraulically disconnected. So.
And let's just describe some of these terms. So when Don is referencing the H5 pump system at 11th, that's east of Hudson, the reason why it's called H5 is because the H5 sewer shed, it's basically like Hoboken doesn't have watersheds, which would be somewhere where rain falls, it collects and then flows to an area with sewer sheds, because we manage our rainwater through the sewer system. And the H5, Don, just generally, so that H5 pump is connected to what area of the city?
ShopRite area. That's
Shop-
basically that
ShopRite
whole
area.
back large section of the city on the southwest side, or I'm sorry, northwest side of Hoboken.
Right.
Look,
And
just
so-
below H7, which is where the North Hudson Sewage Authority.
And
plant is.
the area that people are describing flooding on Hudson Street, what sewer shed is that in, Phil?
That
That's no, that's H5 because
It's also H5?
No, yeah, it's H5, but it's just through a different.
But it's
trunk system.
upstream of that lower area. The
It's
topography.
in a different direction, yeah.
Correct.
So yeah, so the flow comes from two directions. It comes from east to west along the 11th Street trunk sewer, and then actually it comes south on Hudson Street.
Right.
So 11th Street is a collection point. Essentially everything from the entire city goes to the 11th Street siphon head box.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was one more question in the chat for someone who could not attend. She said water came in through the flood vents. What is the purpose of flood vents when a home is in a high elevation area that is not in the flood zone? And can these be somehow sealed without violating any codes?
So the purpose of flood vents is to equalize hydrostatic pressure so that there's not, let's call it forces acting on the foundation of a house that would compromise it. Flood vents are only required in the floodplain. So if there are flood vents, they should be a foot above grade. They are required by code. If your home has flood vents, it means it's in compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. They cannot be closed. And if your home is not in a floodplain, but it has flood vents, they may have been added because it is adjacent to the floodplain or part of a mapped future floodplain. I'd have to have a lot more context to answer that specifically. Feel free to send me an email with the question, but it is a regulated measure so that it really is trying to prevent buoyancy, number one. So like if an entire property is surrounded by water and it's not anchored properly, it can cause uplift, which can compromise the foundation. Similarly, if a property is surrounded by water, it can collapse the foundation. So that's really that's the purpose of a flood vent, and it's part of our regulated floodplain. But again, I'm happy to further take a look at what those issues might be.
And then there was just one other that came in regarding Southwest Hoboken. Why are we not enlarging the sewer system, improving the grade and improving the combined sewer overflows so that the excess is able to leave into the Hudson rather than into the streets and homes in Southwest Hoboken?
So Don, I can try to explain this, and then if you guys want to, so going back preceding Hurricane Irene and Hurricane Sandy, North Hudson commissioned studies to answer that question, and it looked at capacity needed and cost, and the only way to really address sewer related issues would be to separate the systems. So to rebuild the entire stormwater management system with a new system that only handles stormwater and separating it from the sewer system And that system would cost multiple billions of dollars and be extraordinarily disruptive because you're basically rebuilding every street in the city of Hoboken. But what those reports also identified was the basis of design for the different pumping stations that North Hudson has built over the last decade. So that's referencing the pumping station that H1 pumps out Southwest Hoboken, H5 pumping Western Hoboken, and under construction right now, the H6, H7 pumping station that's part of the Northwest Resiliency Park. So those were both cost-effective, practical to implement, and showed flood risk reduction. But I think at the end of the day, this is not an issue we can build our way out of. The volume of water capture needed for the sewer shed that we're in Hoboken, it is on the order of magnitude of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of gallons of storage, because of the intensity that we're seeing of rainfall events and the high percentage of impervious surface. So if our community did not have, high levels of build out on each parcel, sidewalks, roads, there would be a natural system to collect and convey water, ideally back to the Hudson River. But the majority, 70% of Hoboken is in a floodplain, which historically either tidally influenced waters, marshes, wetlands, or streams. So our pre-existing hydrology, the hydrology being kind of like what was Hoboken before it was built out, really limits that ability to restore those natural functions. And Don, if you have anything else to add to that, we're very constrained by the topography and also the tide level. So the western side of the city being 3 to 4 feet above sea level, and our the tide levels that impact the city also being at 3 to 4 feet above sea level.
That you hit the nail on the head, Caleb. The only thing I would add to that is that H1 wet weather pump station that was installed has reduced the flooding in Southwest Hoboken. I send the numbers to Jennifer and Caleb every time we run them to get them, but we're seeing 85 to 88% flood reduction since those pump stations have been installed. So that half a dozen times, of those half a dozen times, I think it was 5 or 6 that it was any sort of significant flooding in the past before that pump station was installed, which was 2012, I believe, right before Sandy. It would have been 60 times. So it's significant how much those pump stations are helping.
So it's very effective against higher precipitation, lower duration events. But where we're seeing its limits are at the same time for these Henri and Ida type events where you have significant amounts of rainwater to manage and it overwhelming the cities in North Hudson's assets.
Yeah, it's really comes down to the system's ability to convey the flow to the H1 pump station. The pipes are flat. When rain comes down very quickly, it just can't make its way to the pump station to be discharged out to the river in a timely fashion. It's just can't keep up.
Thank you. Kay, do you have your hand raised again?
Yes. I believe you were working on some kind of sensor system so that citizens could be notified when overflow events were happening. Can you update us on that, please? And then my second question was, if we do get an alert that an overflow is happening, how meaningful is it if maybe we could send out a NICS alert saying, hey, don't run your dishwasher, don't do your laundry, just don't use your water. Would that make a meaningful difference in terms of flooding?
So the city is working with a vendor to install remote sensing at intersections that are historically prone to flooding. And that will be, I think, probably a lagging indicator. North Hudson has a leading indicator where they are available. They can see our resiliency parks filling up. They can see whether or not the H1 and H5 systems are operating and online. We communicate with them during storm events. The sensor system will be, I think, a point of data for us to understand at what time are we starting to see overflows at intersections. And that will be combined. The city is anticipating installing a barricading system at certain intersections so that travel is prohibited. We have our Office of Emergency Management places barricades at flood-prone intersections, but what we've observed is that motorists do not either follow that or move the barricades themselves. So we're considering the sensor system to give us better real-time information about on-street flooding, along with a barricading system to close circulation at those intersections to, number one, not have motorists traversing flooded intersections where vehicles fail, it impacts our emergency response, but also to not generate waves from vehicular travel, because we've identified that as a persistent issue. And I'm sorry, Kay, I forgot the second part of the question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so it was about, this was really for Don and for Phil. How effective would it be to advise residents not to use their water when there's a big storm? Would that make a difference?
I think the biggest difference that would make would be inside your own house. I mean, to us, that would be kind of a drop in very much larger bucket. But for inside your own property, I mean, yes, if you don't have one of these ejector pump systems and you are prone to flow backing up into your house from your own house, right? It's your own sewage that can't make it out into the system. In that case, absolutely, you should, refrain from, especially, dishwashers, laundry, that sort of thing. But as far as, if you have the ejector pump system that's coming out into the street, it would not help too much.
And Kay, to follow up, we do have those strategies in the addendum. They're just in the working draft at this point.
Okay, does anyone have any other questions? Okay, so with that, I would like to thank all the presenters for this evening. Jessica from Michael Baker International, Chris from LRK, all the members from the city and also from the NHSA, Don and Phil, thank you very much for attending and being able to answer some of these tougher questions for us. And thank you all from the community for joining this evening. And we hope that you benefit from this design guideline that we put out. And again, I dropped the link in for the survey in the chat. We'll be sending another email with the link to the survey. So please do fill that out when you have a moment. And have a great evening, everyone.
And yes, the recording will be available. The city greatly appreciates your input, and we will continue listening and working to help resolve all these different issues. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank you.